It was hailed as an historic step towards regulating the global arms trade, a landmark UN treaty aimed at preventing weapons from ending up in the wrong hands. But after years of negotiations, 3 countries stopped the treaty in its tracks. So what's next for the UN and its effort to police the planet? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Seeker. Iran, Syria and North Korea have blocked a UN treaty aimed at regulating the international arms trade. The treaty was the first of its kind, the result of nearly 10 years of debate. Its goal, quite simply, was to monitor the flow of arms across international borders and stop them from being used to commit atrocities. UN member countries would be forced to take responsibility for incoming weapons, making sure they didn't fall into the wrong hands. All 5 permanent members of the Security Council are major arms exporters, and critics say the agreement was carefully crafted to protect their interests. But in the end, it took only 3 no votes to stop the treaty from being adopted. Al Jazeera's James Bays was there.
The rules of these proceedings called for consensus. Everyone had to agree. But 3 nations, all of them used to international condemnation, voiced their objections. Iran,
due to many legal flaws and loopholes,
then North Korea, and then Syria. The Australian chairing the proceedings, Peter Woolcott, was not going to give up there. He left the rest of the delegates behind and took the 3 ambassadors into a room. Did they really want to block a treaty that had been years in the making? The meeting reconvened.
May I take it that the conference adopts draft decision A/conf/2017/2013/L3.
It was soon clear the 3 countries were unmoved.
Crystal clear, the Islamic Republic of Iran objects to the adoption of the draft decision.
Campaigners and diplomats were angry.
It's been blocked by 3 deeply cynical countries, the Democratic Republic of Korea, Syria and Iran. And those governments, with their records in terms of human rights in their own countries, are just appalling.
The fact that those 3 isolated themselves on this issue says something about their attitude towards the United Nations.
In just a few hours, wild hopes and then great disappointment. But optimism remains. The president of the conference is forwarding the draft treaty to the UN General Assembly, where a majority is all that's needed for it to pass. Despite a mood of despondency among some campaigners and negotiators, there is hope that that vote in the General Assembly could take place within a week. James Bays, Al Jazeera at the United Nations.
So a lot to talk about there. Then let's bring in our guests for more on this. In New York, Paul Holtom, Director of the Arms Transfer Programme at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. In London, we have Shashank Joshi. He's a research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. And also in London, Kay Stearman joins us. She's a spokeswoman for the Campaign Against Arms Trade. Shashank Joshi, if I could start with you, is this, in your view, an effective treaty as it currently stands?
Well, it's more effective than the bilateral provisions we would have in place today. Sorry, the national provisions, whereby each state has its own export controls, but it interprets them incredibly flexibly and in many cases can dispense with them altogether if it feels the need to do so. And so we have situations where countries can push very hard to overturn arms embargoes, for example, against Syria. And as the French and the British suggested last week, if they don't like it, they can go ahead and provide the arms anyway. So it's difficult for me to see how this does any damage to a regime of arms transfers that is pretty lax anyway.
Kay Stearman, what do you believe this will do, if anything, to combat the trade in global arms?
Almost nothing, unfortunately, because obviously the people behind this treaty have pushed it with a great deal of passion and persistence. Our Campaign Against Arms Trade is only interested in a treaty which is going to stop or meaningfully limit the international trade in arms. And this is not going to do it. In fact, in some ways, it's going to legitimize the trade in arms because it seems to think there's a responsible, legitimate trade in arms and other arms trade which is irresponsible and illegitimate. And it's drawing a line between them. And there isn't really a line there as far as we're concerned.
All right, let's get that view. Let's get the view then from Paul Holtom. Is this simply legitimizing the trade in arms around the world?
But the trade in arms is already legitimate already. I think what it's doing, it is drawing a clear line between those transfers that will be unacceptable and on which the UN states, 190 of them, could agree that this was a baseline that could be accepted by them. Some can go higher, but we don't have that minimum standards. It also provides those of us who do monitoring
sorry to interrupt.
act as
The point was made
watchdogs.
there earlier that it is up
Sure.
for debate what is acceptable and what isn't, and it's generally up to the countries that are selling these arms to decide that. Isn't that the argument there?
No, the treaty actually contains three very clear prohibitions. One, that you shall not violate UN arms embargoes. Secondly, that you should be taking measures to avoid illicit trafficking. And thirdly, that you should not be authorising transfers if you have reasonable, good knowledge that these could be used for violations of international humanitarian law. There are also further provisions in there where you have to undertake a risk assessment to ensure that you're not going to be supplying arms for serious violations of human rights, gender-based violence. There's considerations there with regards to diversion. These are things we don't have at a global level currently.
All right, well, let's give you an idea then of institutions like the United Nations are up against here in dealing with this problem. Let's not forget that the global arms trade is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Now, the sales in conventional weapons are worth an estimated $70 billion a year. Small arms and their accessories are especially lucrative at around $8.5 billion a year. 8 million guns and other small arms are manufactured across the globe every year. Do the math, and that works out to more than 20,000 new weapons each day. Then there's the ammunition. Guns are useless without them. More than 12 billion bullets are manufactured each year, and most of them come from the United States. So that gives you an idea of just the magnitude of the problem here, Shashank Joshi. So it begs the question: is the United Nations in a position to effectively enforce this?
Well, I think we have to understand what this is. It's a treaty. It's not a resolution of the UN Security Council. It's a treaty to which individual member states have to sign and then ratify. If they don't sign or ratify them, they can sit outside the prospective arrangements. Now, that doesn't mean they wouldn't be affected by them. So you can compare it, for example, to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Countries like India, Pakistan, Israel have not signed, but they are affected by the NPT because it stops them getting a hold of some stuff they may otherwise have been able to receive from other states. So is the UN able to enforce this? Well, no, it can't enforce this against those states which want to have no part of it. What it can do, though, is enforce it against any state that signs. And then, so if Iran wishes to buy conventional weapons from, say, Croatia or Germany or anywhere else, those states would be restricted from selling it under pain of further UN sanctions or UN measures that it can impose. So the UN isn't able to go around enforcing it perfectly, but it does have some means of enforcement, just as is the case with other treaties which are of this multilateral sort.
Kees Dearman, I know you said earlier that you believe this agreement as it currently stands will do very little to deal with the global trade in arms. What do you believe should be done then to properly combat this?
Well, the problem is that the biggest arms exporters are the 5 members of the Security Council plus Germany. So they're big, rich, powerful countries. And these are the countries that are saying we want an arms trade treaty, but at the same time, they are promoting their own arms industries. They're supporting them, they're subsidizing them. Just to give you one example, British arms industry is subsidized to the tune of about £700 million a year. The British government has an arms sales export unit, which is UK Trade and Investment Defence and Security Organisation, which has got 150 staff. We have the Prime Minister flying off to countries like Indonesia and India and Saudi Arabia with bevies of arms company executives to promote arms sales. Unless countries actually act responsibly themselves and stop supporting their arms industries and stop promoting arms sales, I fear the treaty will do very little to stop that.
Paul Haltom, I mean, this is something that was 7 years in the making. Clearly, the UN has invested a lot of time and effort in its success, but the United Nations has in the past been accused of being largely ineffective on a number of issues of relating to armed conflict in the world. How much faith is there in the United Nations that this can succeed?
I mean, I'd concur with the earlier speaker in terms of this is for states. The UN is not a major part in terms of observing what is going on with regards to this treaty. It's decided by the states parties, the members of the United Nations. We were the ones who'll work out whether this works or not, and will make recommendations in terms of what steps can be taken. I mean, I'd also say that although I concur that the P5 have had a significant role in terms of putting this together and pushing it, but if you're in the room, the loudest and most passionate voices for this treaty come from African states and from Latin America and from those who say they're affected by this trade. And they're the ones who are calling for this too. They were the people who were putting up the statements. It was Kenya that called for this resolution, for a resolution in the General Assembly to have this treaty adopted. I think that's worth bearing in mind too.
Let's talk then about.
You also have to.
Yeah, go ahead, Shashank.
Can I jump in? You also have to ask why Iran, North Korea, and Syria have sought to block this treaty, and why a number of other states have expressed such grave reservations about some of its provisions. Countries like India, Pakistan, Russia, and others.
Why do you believe that? That was actually my next question. Why do you believe they objected to this?
Well, they object to it because they feel, they have different reasons for objecting to this, but one reason is that they feel it will benefit arms exporters in a way that limits what they themselves can receive. That is, the UK, for example, may continue selling arms to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others, but it would be able to, on a political basis, to restrict arms sales, say, to countries like Pakistan if it conducted a policy with which the UK disagreed. And so the idea that this is completely unenforceable, that this can have no effect on how arms move, is belied by the way in which these states have in fact objected to it. I mean, unless we're saying they're completely delusional and misguided, I think we can't write off the efficacy of something like this quickly.
Kees Dearman, what do you think were the motivations for these three countries, Syria, Iran and North Korea, in objecting to this?
I can't speak directly about their motivations. I haven't studied it, but there seems to be countries that are very beleaguered and which feel that this is something directed particularly at them, and that any embargoes, which indeed are affecting them already, would be tightened. I think one of our main concerns about the treaty, going back to why some countries are wary of it, is that this is what the British Foreign Office says, it is there to create a level playing field and to make British arms industries more competitive. And I think there is a fear that the big arms companies, which already dominate the trade, would get bigger and more powerful and then squeeze out other industries in other countries. So that seems to be one of the nascent fears behind some objections.
Paul Haltom, I mean, how much is, let's talk, for example, first of all, about more specifically Iran and Syria's objections to this. How much are Iran's objections to this treaty connected with its strong support of the Assad government in Syria?
I think all along there's been, these states have acted in bad faith throughout the negotiations, putting on the table suggestions and suggesting that their views have to be taken into account if you want to achieve consensus. They've been willing to exercise this sort of veto all along. I think that's been in their pocket. And of course the timeliness issue with regard to events in the Middle East and also with regards to North Korea, I'm sure that also factors into their motivations here. I think the key issue also in terms of they probably do feel that they've been affected by multilateral measures, but I think there's also, as was spoken about earlier, they've also been responsible for some of the sort of what we'd call illicit arms trafficking. They've been involved, actors in those countries have been involved in diversions to conflict areas, to end users that we wouldn't want to receive weapons.
Shashank Joshi,
also made
go ahead.
Can I supplement that and also say, although it's absolutely true the UK and other P5 countries have been responsible for an extremely large share of the world's arms exports, including small arms, there is a certain openness to that process. You can at least see what the UK has sold, even to those countries that commit human rights abuses. In Iran's case, and the case of many other countries like North Korea, they have engaged in small arms proliferation that is far, far more unaccountable, illicit and unregistered. And I think even if we are willing to criticise the UK, the US and other countries for having insufficient procedures on export controls, they are still far better than anything Iran has shown in the past several years as it's scattered arms and ammunition across the globe.
I want to ask you, Shashank, about, if I can get back to Syria's explanations for objecting to this, Shashank. Bashar Jafari, the Syrian ambassador to the UN, said that arms shipments to what he called terrorist groups and non-state actors should have been banned, but the violence, the argument goes, the violence inflicted on civilians in Syria by government forces there means that this treaty, in effect, could well curb weapon supplies to the Syrian government, couldn't it?
In theory, yes, it would provide legal grounds for the Security Council to take up a case. As we know, currently there is no arms embargo on Syria. There is no multilateral arms embargo on Syria. There are individual European embargoes, there are national embargoes. There is no legal reason why Russia or Iran has to technically stop. Well, Iran, there are legal reasons, but there's no legal reason why Russia has to stop sending arms to Assad in a multilateral UN sense. So this would provide another layer of scrutiny against the regime. You could make the case, however, it would also constrict the legal grounds on which Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar and others, and European countries would be able to send arms to the rebels as well, because some rebel units have also committed human rights abuses, and there would be legal grounds for trying to clamp down on that as well. I mean, you know, we don't know who would arbitrate many of these questions because, of course, again, this is just a framework, it's a treaty. The exact details are yet to be hashed out.
Paul Holtom, I know you wanted to jump in there earlier.
Yeah, I was going to mention that I think one of the important provisions from our perspective at SIPRI is that it includes transparency mechanisms. It's a call for states to make information publicly available, well, implicitly publicly available with regard to their transfers and decisions. And I mean, we've seen over the past few years the UN Register of Conventional Arms a decline in reporting, and hopefully this would be a spur to open that up so we can make assessments, whether that's state parties, whether that's civil society, parliamentarians. More information should be made available, hopefully as a result of this arrangement, if it comes through next week.
Okay, Stearman, do you think...
I would far rather that any weapons sent by the Europeans or the Americans, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey to rebels in Syria, for example, are registered, open, declared for all to see, rather than illicit, under the radar and covert.
Well, let's get Kay's view on that. Does this do anything to address the issues of transparency?
Well, we've been working to try and get the British government to be more transparent in its arms export information. And we have succeeded to a little bit, but certainly there's a lot of gaps there. For example, we'd like to know who the end user is, whether it's going to police, military, paramilitary, or might be anti-piracy operations or whatever. So there's a long way to go, even for countries such as the UK and European Union countries, where there are these regulations and these information in place.
All right, let's get the view from some of our viewers now. Go ahead.
So I was just going to say, I mean, I agree that, but I think it's worth recognising that the UK and a number of European countries have set a far higher standard with regards to transparency than many states around the world, and especially with a number of suppliers emerging, I think it's important that they also are required to raise their standards and we start to see information about what they're providing.
Let's get the view then from...
Yes, but transparency doesn't necessarily mean that... it's good to have transparency, but it's only a first step. It doesn't necessarily mean that arms don't go to countries in conflict or countries that are human rights abusers. We've seen this with the UK exports, which still exports to Saudi Arabia, which is an egregious human rights abuser.
Shashank Joshi, what's your view on that?
I think I can't object to that statement. It's correct. Transparency is the first step, and then it doesn't stop you from continuing to send arms to those countries that may have terrible human rights records. But I still think the bar that Kay has set out, which is a full restrictions on all kinds of conventional transfers for every state, that isn't going to happen. It's never going to happen. So I will take the more realistically available treaty that is on offer today. We will never get a fully restrictive blanket treaty because ultimately these are treaties. They have to be agreed to by individual states. And if anyone thinks the UK is going to stop exporting arms to Saudi Arabia anytime soon, well, I mean, that's completely unrealistic. That isn't going to happen.
Well, we've been reaching out to you, our viewers, for your thoughts on the failed UN arms agreement. Callum Begg says what a predictable outcome this is, and one that represents the impotence of the UN to deal with issues of global importance. To think that a decade of rhetorical capital has been invested in this process is simply laughable. James Gia says increasing UN sanctions against these arrogant countries is the only explanation the three can give for choosing to veto. A reference there to the objections of the three countries, Iran, North Korea and Syria. And Darren Griffin says, sadly, the UN is becoming increasingly impotent with protectionist behaviour on virtually every vote they seem to take. So, I mean, this is just to get back to Kay Stearman on this. This kind of speaks to what you were saying earlier, that when the biggest offenders in all of this are the ones who are intimately involved in this agreement. That is part of the problem, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And this is one reason why we didn't support an arms trade treaty. We want to stop the arms trade, but we are also realistic as well as idealistic. And though we know that it would take a very long time, we're more than prepared to take, support realistic interim steps to stopping the arms trade. We would like to see an end to arms sales to repressive regimes, to countries in conflict, and to countries with urgent social needs. But we believe we can't support an arms trade treaty which is not going to make real steps towards stopping the arms trade or even limiting it. And that's our position, unfortunately, from the point of view of all these people.
Can I point out very quickly?
Felt very passionately, supported it.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead,
point
Shashank,
one thing
briefly.
out, which is it's very interesting to note why this treaty is being designed by consensus. And one of the reasons is the United States many years ago pushed for the mechanism to be consensus so it could block any outcome it didn't like, particularly protecting its own constitutional right to bear arms. So that is one of the bases on which we have this consensus-based process for the treaty to take into effect.
Was that the right way to go, though? To base it on consensus?
I haven't got much sympathy for those who say the UN can't get anything done. I mean, if you had a situation where the US or the Europeans could push their own favoured outcome through, we would have accusations of the UN as an imperialistic body. So I'm sorry, the UN is designed to allow vetoes by states which have a stake in the outcome. If you didn't have it that way, you'd have wails of protest when a treaty could be rammed through against the wishes of a number of key states. So that's how it is. That's the UN. Take it or leave it.
Paul Holton, what do you think is going to happen next here then?
Next week?
Yeah,
I think the President will present his report, and then I would assume...
The agreement as it currently stands has been objected to by these three countries. What happens next, do you believe?
My understanding is that it will be taken to a vote in the General Assembly. It's been sent to the Secretary General. This proposal's been put forward by a number of states, and I would assume that it'll get the majority that's required. It's basically Iran, DPRK and Syria have had their moment of futility. They've identified themselves as problem actors once more. A number of other states expressed their reservations, both in terms of that it wasn't strong enough, it wasn't doing more, and others that felt that there were things in there that they wanted to change. But I think it'll pass through probably next week.
So it's more an issue of that they've had their say and everyone else is going to move on.
I think it's an issue that they've stood up and they've made everyone has expressed their reservations in different ways about the treaty. Others were willing to accept that this had been agreed through consensus, and that although you couldn't get everything you wanted in there, you had to make bargains. That's the nature of doing negotiations with the United Nations. I think there's also those who feel that, although I don't believe this is rightly a disarmament and arms control treaty, many of the people there are ambassadors who work in that field, and if you go to Geneva, they're discussing the same things they've been discussing for decades. And here you had something that's actually progressed in, for UN, a relatively short period of time.
That is going to have to be the last word. I want to thank all three of our guests, Shashank Joshi, Paul Hotham and Kay Stearman. Thanks very much for your time. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. As always, send us your feedback at insidestory@aljazeera.net. In the meantime, I'm Hazem Sika. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.